The story of Deuteronomy begins at a moment of profound anticipation. After 40 years of wandering through deserts and valleys, the people of Israel stood on the edge of the promised land. They had endured hunger and thirst. They had faced battles and doubts, yet here they were, ready to step into the inheritance that had been promised long ago to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was a moment charged with history and destiny, a moment where the past met the future in the plains of Moab. At the center of this gathering stood Moses, the faithful leader who had walked with them through every trial. He had confronted Pharaoh, lifted his staff over the Red Sea, climbed Sinai to receive the law, and pleaded for the people when they had gone astray. Now he knew his own journey was nearing its close. He would not cross into the land with them, but his final words would carry a weight far greater than any military strategy or political plan. Moses delivered a farewell message that was more than a speech. It was a renewal of the covenant, a reminder of identity, and a call to faithfulness. His voice carried the urgency of a man who knew his time was short, but also the passion of one who had seen the faithfulness of God firsthand. He urged the people not to forget, not to turn aside, and not to think that blessing would come without obedience. His words pressed upon them the seriousness of their calling. The generation that now listened was not the same as the one that had left Egypt. Their parents had fallen in the wilderness, but they had grown up under the discipline of desert life. They had eaten manna, they had seen God's presence in cloud and fire, and they had walked every weary step of the long journey. Now they were being asked to carry forward the covenant, to live as God's chosen people in a land flowing with promise. The Book of Deuteronomy is not only about laws and commands, it is about the heart of a relationship. It is about remembering where you came from, understanding who you are, and choosing whom you will serve. Its message has power not just for ancient Israel, but for every generation that longs to live with purpose, faith, and devotion. If you enjoy learning about these timeless stories and truths, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps keep these teachings alive and spreads them to others who might be encouraged by them. Moses began by calling the people to remember the journey that had carried them from Egypt through the long years of wandering. Memory was not a casual act, it was a sacred duty, for memory anchors identity and keeps a people from drifting into forgetfulness. He recounted how God had guided them with signs and wonders, how they had been led through barren lands where survival was impossible apart from divine provision. In those early days they saw with their own eyes the mighty acts that proved the Lord's power, and they learned that their deliverance was not by strength of arms, but by grace. He reminded them of their moments of weakness, of the rebellion at Kadesh, where fear overcame trust, and an entire generation forfeited their inheritance. That failure marked their story, and its lesson was carved into their history, showing that unbelief leads only to loss. Yet even in judgment, mercy remained. God did not abandon them in the wilderness, and though their fathers fell, the children were nourished by daily bread from heaven, water from the rock, and guidance from above. The journey was also filled with battles, and Moses spoke of the kings they had faced and defeated, kings whose strength seemed intimidating, yet who fell when Israel trusted in the Lord. Victories over Sihon and Og became reminders that no power could stand against the promise of God when his people walked in obedience. These victories were not only military triumphs, they were spiritual milestones, affirming that the promise of land was real and attainable if they would continue in faith. Moses wanted the people to understand that their wilderness years were not wasted time. They were years of training, years in which their character was shaped, their faith tested, and their dependence deepened. The harshness of the desert became a school of the soul, teaching lessons of humility and reliance that would prepare them for the prosperity of the land ahead. For abundance can be more dangerous than scarcity, and Moses knew that hearts must be trained before hands can receive. He recalled how even in their disobedience, God remained faithful. When they complained for food, they were given manna. When they grew thirsty, water was provided. When serpents struck, a bronze serpent was lifted up for healing. These moments were not only about survival, they revealed the mercy of a God who disciplines but does not destroy, who corrects but also restores. Memory was meant to humble them. Israel was reminded not to claim credit for victories or survival, for without God, they would have perished in the desert. Pride had no place in their story, only gratitude and loyalty. Moses called them to see that their past was a mirror, reflecting both their failures and God's faithfulness. Forgetting either would endanger their future. To remember the journey was also to remember the covenant. Every step in the wilderness was tied to the promises given long before, promises that stretched back to Abraham. Each day they lived in the wilderness. They lived under a covenant that was older than they were, a covenant that defined who they were called to be. This remembrance kept them from thinking of themselves as merely wanderers. They were heirs of a divine promise. By recounting the past, Moses showed them that memory has power. It shapes perspective, it warns against repeating mistakes, and it inspires trust for the future. The wilderness was behind them, but its lessons were to be carried forward into the land they would inherit. To forget the journey would be to walk blindly into temptation, but to remember it would be to walk wisely, with eyes open to the cost of disobedience and the blessing of faith. After reminding them of the past, Moses turned to the heart of his message, the reaffirmation of the covenant. This was not a contract between equals, but a bond of loyalty between the Creator and his chosen people. The covenant declared who they were, set apart not by their own merit, but by divine choice. To reaffirm it was to declare again that they belonged to God, that their lives, their land, and their destiny were inseparably bound to his will. Moses spoke with gravity, stressing that this covenant was not to be treated lightly. It was not a matter of convenience, not a pact that could be broken when circumstances changed. It was binding, carrying with it blessings for obedience and curses for rebellion. To accept the covenant was to step into life itself, for in God's commands were found not restrictions meant to crush, but guidance meant to preserve. The covenant was rooted in love. God had chosen them, not because they were great in number or powerful in reputation, but because he loved them and desired to reveal his holiness through them. That love demanded a response, not half-hearted or conditional, but wholehearted devotion. To live under the covenant meant to let loyalty shape every aspect of life, from worship to work, from community to family. Moses made clear that this covenant was not only for those standing before him that day, it was for their children and their children's children, for generations yet unborn. By reaffirming it, they were binding their future to God, securing their identity across time. This was not merely an agreement for the present, it was a declaration that would shape Israel's destiny. The covenant also defined holiness. Israel was called to be different, not to blend with the nations around them, but to reflect the character of God. Their laws, their worship, their daily living were to be marked by a distinctiveness that revealed the presence of the Lord among them. To reaffirm the covenant was to embrace this difference, to live as a light among the nations. The seriousness of the covenant demanded careful attention. Every word mattered, every command carried significance, and obedience was not optional. Yet even in its weight, the covenant was a gift, for it offered a way of life that led to flourishing. By walking in it, Israel would find blessing, protection, and the joy of communion with God. Moses reminded them that covenant unfaithfulness was not hidden from God. He sees the heart, and he knows when devotion turns to mere ritual. To break covenant was not only to violate law, but to betray relationship. It was a turning away from life itself. His appeal was that they embrace the covenant with sincerity, not out of fear alone, but out of love and gratitude. By reaffirming the covenant, Israel was choosing their path. They were declaring their allegiance, not to idols, not to foreign powers, but to the Lord who had redeemed them. This choice would shape their identity and their destiny. For Moses, it was vital that they grasped this truth before stepping into the land, for only by covenant loyalty would they remain secure. At the heart of Moses' words came a declaration that would echo through all generations of Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. These words were more than a creed. They were the foundation of faith, calling the people to recognize the uniqueness of their God and the exclusivity of their devotion. In a world filled with idols and rival deities, this proclamation was a bold and defining truth. The call began with hearing. Israel was summoned not simply to listen, but to take in the truth deeply, to let it sink into their hearts and shape their lives. To hear was to obey, to take words from sound into action. The command was not passive, it was active, demanding response. The response required was love. They were commanded to love the Lord with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their strength. This love was not sentiment alone. It was loyalty, devotion, and commitment. It was a love that embraced the whole person, mind and will, emotions and actions, spirit and body. Nothing was to be withheld, for divided love would soon give way to idolatry. This love would shape their worship. They were not to scatter their devotion among many gods, nor to bow to images of stone or wood. Their worship was to be directed to the one true God, the Creator and Redeemer who had chosen them. Pure devotion was not optional. It was the very essence of their covenant identity. Love would also shape their daily life. To love God with all one's heart meant to live in a way that reflected His holiness. Justice, kindness, honesty, mercy, all were expressions of love for God lived out in the human sphere. Faithfulness in business, compassion for the poor, truthfulness in speech. These were not merely social virtues, they were acts of covenant love. Obedience flowed naturally from this love. If they loved Him, they would walk in His ways. Commands would not feel burdensome when the heart was bound to the one who gave them. The law was not a prison, it was freedom, for it kept them close to the source of life. To obey was not merely to follow rules, it was to honor the relationship that defined them. Moses urged that these words be upon their hearts, not kept at a distance but internalized, guiding their choices and shaping their desires. Love and obedience were not to be external displays, but deep commitments written on the soul. By living in this way, Israel would remain rooted in truth and guarded against the seductions of idolatry. The call to love and obey was not a single moment, it was a lifelong posture. Each day required a fresh hearing, a renewed commitment, a deliberate choice to love God above all else. In this call, Moses revealed the essence of covenant faith, that to belong to God is to give Him the whole of life, unreserved and undivided. Moses knew that the covenant could not survive if it was not passed on. He urged the people to take the words of God and impress them diligently upon their children. Faith was not meant to fade with one generation, it was meant to be carried forward, shaping families, communities, and nations across time. To neglect teaching was to risk forgetting, and forgetting would bring ruin. He called parents to speak of God's words in daily life, not only in moments of worship, but in the rhythm of ordinary days. Whether sitting at home or walking along the road, whether rising in the morning or lying down at night, every part of life was an opportunity to remind children of who they were and to whom they belonged. Faith was not confined to ritual, it was woven into the fabric of living. Moses urged that these words be written and bound, placed as reminders upon hands and between eyes, fixed upon doorposts and gates. Symbols mattered, for they kept truth visible and present. A child growing up in Israel would be surrounded by reminders, taught through repetition and shaped by the constancy of covenant memory. The passing of faith was not only about words, it was also about example. Parents were to live what they taught, showing in their actions the loyalty they professed. Children would learn as much from watching as from hearing, and a life consistent with covenant truth was the most powerful teacher of all. Teaching the next generation also preserved the community. A nation that forgot its God would be swept away by idolatry, but a nation that diligently taught its children would remain strong. Each generation was a link in the chain, carrying forward the covenant so that the promises given long ago would remain alive in living memory. This responsibility was sacred. To neglect it was to break the chain, to risk a generation rising up that did not know the Lord. History had already shown the cost of forgetfulness, and Moses warned that it must not be repeated. The survival of covenant faith depended on deliberate teaching, faithful living, and constant reminding. The task was also hopeful. To see children grow in faith was to witness the promise of God taking root in new hearts. It was to know that the covenant would endure, not as words carved in stone alone, but as truth engraved upon the lives of sons and daughters. Every parent, every elder, every teacher bore a part in this holy work, ensuring that the light of covenant loyalty would never be extinguished. Moses painted a picture of a future where faith was alive across generations, where children learned from parents, and parents found joy in seeing their children walk in truth. It was a vision of continuity, of heritage, of blessing that did not stop with one people at one time, but spread through families as an inheritance of life. Moses turned their attention to the laws that would guide them in the land. These were not arbitrary rules meant to burden them. They were living instructions designed to create a society shaped by justice, mercy, and holiness. The laws revealed God's concern not only for worship, but for daily living, for relationships, for community, and for the treatment of the vulnerable. They were to be a people whose life together reflected the character of the one who had chosen them. Justice stood at the heart of these laws. The people were commanded to judge fairly, not showing partiality to the rich or to the poor, but weighing each case with righteousness. Bribery was forbidden, for it corrupts judgment, and oppression was condemned, for it destroys trust. The law lifted high the standard of truth, calling the nation to reflect the justice of God in its courts and assemblies. Mercy was also woven into the commands. Israel was reminded to care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. These groups, often overlooked and easily exploited, were to be protected and provided for. Harvest laws ensured that the edges of the fields were left for those in need, debts were to be released in due season, and servants were to be treated with dignity. Compassion was not an afterthought, it was central to the covenant vision. Holiness shaped every part of life. The people were instructed to remain pure in their worship, rejecting idolatry and cleansing themselves from practices that defiled. Dietary laws, festivals, and rituals were not empty ceremonies. They served to mark Israel as distinct, reminding them daily that they were set apart. Holiness was not only for priests, it was for the entire nation, a calling that touched family, work, and community. The law was also practical, addressing matters of property, responsibility, and restitution. If harm was done, it required restoration, teaching accountability and fairness. If disputes arose, they were settled with care, not with vengeance. In this way, the law promoted peace and order, ensuring that society would not be driven by selfishness or violence. Through the laws, Israel learned that faithfulness was not only about sacrifices on an altar, but about how one treated a neighbor. Love for God was expressed in love for people, and holiness was shown not only in worship, but in daily acts of integrity and kindness. The law became the measure of devotion, guiding them in both worship and conduct. Moses reminded them that obedience to these laws would bring blessing. A community marked by justice would flourish. A society built on mercy would be strong, and a people who lived in holiness would experience the presence of God among them. These laws were not chains, they were paths of life, leading to a nation where righteousness and compassion worked hand in hand. The laws of Deuteronomy reveal a vision of a people living in harmony, guided by principles that protect the weak, uphold truth, and honor God. By embracing them, Israel would not only survive in the land, they would thrive, becoming a testimony to the nations around them of what it means to live under the rule of the one true God. Moses turned next to worship, reminding the people that when they entered the land, they were not to worship wherever and however they pleased. God himself would choose the place where his name would dwell, a central sanctuary where sacrifices and offerings would be brought. This centralization of worship was not meant to limit them, but to preserve purity, keeping them from scattering devotion among the high places of the nations around them. Israel was warned against idolatry in every form. They were to tear down altars of false gods, break sacred pillars, and burn images. The land was to be cleansed of every trace of idolatry, for even the smallest compromise would lead to corruption. Their worship was to be pure, directed only to the Lord, without mixing the practices of foreign peoples. The place God would choose was not yet revealed, but its future selection reminded them that worship was not to be shaped by human preference. It was God's prerogative to set apart the place where his people would gather, reminding them that worship is always directed by his will and not human imagination. Sacrifices and offerings were to be brought there, not left scattered across the land. This central focus ensured unity among the tribes, binding them together as one people under one covenant. Worship was not to become fragmented, nor was it to be left to personal innovation. It was to be marked by order, reverence, and devotion to the one true God. Moses reminded them that worship involved joy as well as sacrifice. Festivals would be times of gathering, of rejoicing before the Lord, of celebrating his goodness in harvest and provision. Worship was not grim duty, it was the delight of a people rejoicing in their God, offering thanks for blessings received. At the same time, they were to avoid curiosity about how the nations worshipped their gods. They were not to imitate foreign rituals, nor to borrow practices, even if they seemed appealing. Idolatry was not simply false, it was destructive, leading hearts astray and corrupting the soul. Worship of God required exclusivity, devotion unshared and uncompromised. Moses emphasized that the people were to listen carefully to the commands and not add or subtract from them. Worship was holy, not subject to human alteration. By keeping the commands as given, Israel would remain in truth, protected from error and deception. The call to worship in the place God chose was a call to unity, purity, and faithfulness. It reminded them that the center of their life was not the land itself, nor their prosperity, but the presence of God among them. Worship was the heartbeat of the covenant, and in the land it was to remain central, shaping the life of the nation. As Israel prepared to enter the land, Moses spoke of the roles of leadership that would shape their future. He described kings, priests, and prophets, each with a place in the life of the nation, each under the authority of God. Leadership was never to become self-serving. It was to be marked by humility, accountability, and obedience, When the people would one day desire a king, that king was not to be like those of other nations. He was not to amass wealth, multiply horses, or gather wives for himself, for such pursuits would lead his heart astray. Instead, the king was to be a servant leader, bound by the covenant and subject to the law. He was to write for himself a copy of the law, read it daily, and live by it. In this way, even the highest ruler would remain under the authority of God. Priests were given the responsibility of guarding holiness. They were to teach the people the difference between clean and unclean, holy and profane. Their role was not only in sacrifice, but in instruction, helping the nation understand what it meant to live in covenant faithfulness. They bore the privilege of ministering before God, but also the responsibility of guiding others in truth. The prophets were raised up to speak the word of God. Unlike the diviners or sorcerers of the nations, the prophets were chosen by God to deliver his message, whether of encouragement, warning, or correction. They were not to speak from their own imagination, and those who presumed to do so faced judgment. True prophecy was marked by faithfulness to God's word and by fulfillment in reality. Moses made it clear that all leadership was accountable. Kings could not rule apart from the law, priests could not minister without holiness, and prophets could not speak apart from truth. Every leader was under God, and any attempt to rise above his authority was rebellion. This structure ensured that power remained balanced, preventing corruption from overtaking the nation. The people were warned to test prophecy carefully. Not every voice that claimed to speak for God was genuine, and discernment was required. False prophets would lead people astray, but true prophets would guide them back to covenant faith. The responsibility of the nation was to listen with care, weighing every word against the commands already given. This framework of kings, priests, and prophets revealed a vision of leadership unlike the nations around them. It was not about domination or self-glory. It was about service, guidance, and truth. Leaders were to reflect the character of God, reminding the people continually that their ultimate ruler was the Lord himself. By outlining these roles, Moses prepared Israel for the future, showing them that even as they grew and developed, their life as a nation would remain under God's authority. Leadership was not freedom to do as one pleased. It was stewardship, a sacred trust given to those who would guide the people in faithfulness. One of the most solemn moments in Moses' address came when he spoke of blessings and curses. He set before the people two paths, one leading to life and prosperity, the other to destruction and loss. The choice was clear, yet its weight was heavy, for it carried consequences not only for individuals, but for the entire nation. The blessings promised for obedience were abundant. If the people listened to God's commands and walked in his ways, they would experience prosperity in the land. Their crops would yield plentiful harvests, their herds would increase, their families would flourish. Their enemies would be driven back, and they would live in security. Every part of their life would reflect the favor of God, who delights to bless those who walk in faithfulness. But the curses for disobedience were just as clear. If they turned from God, if they pursued idols or rejected his commands, they would face drought, disease, famine, and defeat. Their land would withhold its fruit, their enemies would overpower them, and their security would crumble. Rebellion would bring ruin, for separation from God meant separation from life itself. These blessings and curses were not random punishments. They were the natural outworking of covenant faithfulness or covenant betrayal. To walk in obedience was to remain close to the source of life. But to walk in rebellion was to cut oneself off from that source, leading inevitably to decay and destruction. Moses described the blessings and curses in vivid detail, leaving no room for doubt. He wanted the people to feel the seriousness of their choice, to understand that covenant was not a casual agreement, but a binding commitment with real consequences. Blessing was not automatic, and neither was judgment arbitrary. Both flowed directly from their response to God's commands. This moment was a call to decision. Israel stood on the threshold of the land, and before them lay two roads. They could choose obedience and live in abundance, or choose rebellion and suffer loss. The choice was theirs, but the outcome was fixed. The power of choice carried the weight of destiny. Moses set these blessings and curses before them as both promise and warning. He longed for them to choose life, to walk in faithfulness, to embrace the covenant with wholehearted devotion. His words echoed with urgency, pressing upon them the reality that their future would rise or fall on the basis of their obedience. The blessings and curses reveal the seriousness of covenant relationship. They remind every generation that faith is not abstract, it is lived, and its consequences shape the course of life. For Israel, the power of choice was before them, and the voice of Moses called them to choose wisely, to choose life. Moses spoke with intensity when he warned against idolatry. The temptation to turn aside to other gods would be constant in the land, for the nations surrounding Israel were filled with carved images, altars, and rituals that promised prosperity and pleasure. Yet these idols were lifeless, the work of human hands, unable to hear or to save. To bow before them was to exchange truth for falsehood, to trade the living God for what could neither speak nor move. Israel was reminded that idolatry was not only foolish, it was dangerous. It drew the heart away from loyalty, it weakened devotion, and it invited judgment. The covenant relationship demanded exclusivity, a love undivided and a worship unshared. To serve idols was not merely breaking a rule, it was betraying the bond of love and faithfulness that defined their identity as the people of God. Moses urged them to destroy every trace of idolatry they encountered. Altars were to be torn down, sacred images burned, and every remnant of false worship removed from the land. Compromise was not an option, for even the smallest allowance could grow into a snare. Purity of devotion was essential, for divided hearts would soon lead to a divided nation. The warning against idolatry was also a warning against forgetting. Prosperity in the land might tempt them to believe their success came by their own strength, but such thinking was itself a form of idolatry, placing trust in human ability rather than in God. Idolatry could take the form of statues, but it could also take the subtler form of pride and self-reliance. Moses reminded them that their God was a consuming fire, jealous for their devotion. This jealousy was not petty or insecure. It was the rightful claim of the Creator who alone gives life. His covenant love was exclusive, and he would not share his glory with false gods. To worship him was to acknowledge his rightful place as the only source of truth and power. The people were warned that idolatry would bring destruction. If they abandoned the covenant and turned to false gods, they would be uprooted from the land, scattered among nations, and suffer loss. The consequences were not distant possibilities. They were near and certain if disobedience prevailed. At the same time, Moses reminded them that devotion to God brought freedom. Unlike idols that enslave and demand without giving, the living God offered life, blessing, and joy. To choose him was to walk in light, to experience truth, and to live securely in his presence. The warning was clear. Israel must choose God alone. Their survival, their prosperity, and their identity depended upon this choice. In a world filled with idols, their distinctiveness would shine only through exclusive loyalty. By rejecting idolatry and clinging to God, they would remain true to their covenant calling and secure in their inheritance. After warning them of idolatry, Moses returned to the theme of loyalty. The covenant was not simply about outward obedience, it was about the heart and the soul. God desired devotion that was internal as well as external, a faith that flowed from love rather than from mere ritual. Moses called the people to cling to God, to walk in his ways, and to let their loyalty be the center of their lives. He urged them to remember that obedience was not a burden, but a blessing. Every command was given for their good, shaping them into a people who would flourish in the land. To keep the covenant was to align their lives with truth, to walk in harmony with the Creator, and to experience the joy of His favor. Moses emphasized that covenant loyalty was not only individual, but communal. The whole nation was bound together by this commitment, and each person's faithfulness contributed to the strength of the people as a whole. Disobedience weakened the community, but shared loyalty built unity and strength. The call to loyalty was expressed in vivid language. Moses described it as loving God with all heart and soul, binding His words upon their lives and teaching them diligently to their children. This was not a shallow allegiance. It was a deep, abiding commitment that shaped identity, choices, and destiny. Moses reminded them that the covenant demanded consistency. It was not to be remembered only in moments of crisis or worship, but to be lived out daily. Whether working in the field, walking along the road, or gathering in the home, loyalty was to be constant, flowing into every part of life. He also urged them to remember the consequences of disobedience. To turn from God was to choose death and curse, but to remain loyal was to choose life and blessing. The covenant was clear. Devotion brought prosperity, but betrayal brought ruin. This choice was not abstract. It was lived out in the practical realities of the land and the community. Loyalty was not to be based on fear alone, but on gratitude. The God who had redeemed them from Egypt, who had sustained them in the wilderness, who had defeated their enemies, deserved their love and devotion. Gratitude was the wellspring of loyalty, leading to joyful obedience and heartfelt commitment. Moses called them to make this covenant loyalty their defining characteristic. More than wealth, more than strength, more than reputation, their true identity lay in their relationship with God. Heart and soul commitment would secure their place in the land and preserve their destiny as the people of God. Moses, guided by divine revelation, spoke of the future with sobering clarity. He foresaw that the people would not remain faithful, that they would turn aside to idolatry and disobedience, and that as a result they would be driven into exile. The land promised to them would not remain theirs if they betrayed the covenant, and they would find themselves scattered among nations. This prophecy was not spoken to discourage, but to warn, to show the seriousness of their calling. The exile was described as a time of suffering, of loss, and of longing. The people would serve foreign gods, live under foreign rulers, and feel the weight of separation from the land of promise. This was the consequence of turning from God, and it would be bitter. Yet even in this warning, Moses spoke of hope, for exile would not be the final word. He promised that when the people turned back with all their heart and soul, God would restore them. Repentance would open the door to mercy, and even in distant lands, God would hear their cry. The covenant was not broken beyond repair. It held within it the possibility of renewal and restoration. Moses described how God would gather them from the nations, bringing them back to the land once lost. Their exile would not erase their identity. They would remain His people, and His mercy would reach them even in judgment. The promise of return was woven into the fabric of warning, showing that God's discipline was always aimed at redemption. This prophecy revealed the depth of God's foreknowledge. He knew their weakness, He knew their tendency to wander, yet He also revealed His plan to restore. The covenant included both justice and mercy, both discipline and hope. It was a covenant that reflected His unchanging character, steadfast in love even when His people faltered. The return from exile would also bring renewal of heart. Moses spoke of a day when God would circumcise their hearts, enabling them to love Him more fully and walk in His ways with greater devotion. This inner transformation pointed to a future where obedience would flow not only from command, but from desire, from hearts reshaped by grace. The prophecy of exile and return reminded Israel that history itself was under God's control. Their choices mattered, their disobedience carried consequences, yet God's mercy always provided a way back. Exile was real, but restoration was promised. Loss would come, but renewal would follow. This vision gave hope, even as it warned. It assured the people that though they might fall, they were never beyond the reach of mercy. The covenant relationship was enduring, and God's commitment to his people would not fail, even when they stumbled. As his time drew near to its close, Moses taught the people a song, a poetic witness that would remain with them long after his voice was silent. This song was not merely a hymn of praise. It was a testimony, a reminder of God's faithfulness and Israel's likely unfaithfulness. It was meant to echo in their hearts, to be remembered in times of joy and in times of sorrow, serving as both warning and encouragement. The song proclaimed the greatness of God, declaring his justice, his faithfulness, and his perfection. Unlike the gods of the nations, the Lord was righteous in all his ways, without fault or corruption. His deeds were mighty, his character unchanging, his covenant love enduring. The song began by lifting up his glory, setting the stage for all that followed. It then turned to Israel, recalling how God had chosen them, cared for them, and carried them as a father carries a child. He had found them in the wilderness, protected them, nourished them, and led them with tenderness. Their history was filled with his mercy, and the song celebrated the care that had shaped their identity. Yet the song also spoke of rebellion. It foretold that Israel would grow complacent in prosperity, forgetting the one who had blessed them and turning instead to idols. It warned that their ingratitude would provoke judgment, that they would face the consequences of forsaking their covenant. The words were sharp, not to condemn alone, but to caution, to stir them to vigilance. The song described how God's judgment would come, how enemies would rise against them, how the land would suffer under their disobedience. But even in judgment, the song spoke of mercy. God would not utterly destroy his people, for his covenant love was stronger than their failure. He would remember them, have compassion, and restore them for the sake of his name. This song was to be taught to the people, to be passed on from generation to generation. It would serve as a witness, reminding them of the truth when they strayed, convicting them when they forgot, and encouraging them when they repented. Its words were to be sung in times of gathering, a constant reminder of the covenant story. By teaching the song, Moses gave Israel a gift that would outlive him. His voice might fade, but the song would remain, carrying his message across centuries. It was a living testimony, echoing with themes of justice, mercy, warning, and hope. The Song of Moses revealed the complexity of covenant life. It acknowledged human weakness. It warned of judgment, yet it always pointed to the mercy of God. It was a witness for generations, ensuring that no matter how far Israel wandered, they would always hear the echo of truth calling them back. Before his departure, Moses gathered the tribes and spoke words of blessing over them. These blessings were not formal declarations only. They were filled with the heart of a leader who had carried the people through trials, rebellion, and hope. They echoed the tenderness of a father addressing his children, words that revealed affection, gratitude, and longing for their future. Each tribe was remembered in its uniqueness. Moses spoke of Reuben, praying that he would live and not be few. Judah was blessed with strength for battle and divine help against his foes. Levi was commended for his loyalty, for his role in teaching the law, and for his service at the altar. Benjamin was spoken of as beloved, dwelling securely under the shelter of God's presence. Joseph received a blessing rich in imagery, filled with abundance of land and fertility, reflecting the fruitfulness of his inheritance. Zebulun and Issachar were remembered for their prosperity, their joy in work and in worship. Gad was described as strong and bold, Dan as swift, Naphtali as filled with favor, and Asher as blessed among brothers, secure in strength and provision. These words revealed more than tribal futures. They showed the care of a leader who saw the potential and destiny of each people. Moses spoke with the authority of one guided by God, yet also with the intimacy of one who had lived alongside these tribes through every hardship of the wilderness. His blessings were personal, tailored to their identity and calling. The blessings were also a reminder that every tribe, though distinct, belonged to the greater whole of Israel. Each one had a role, a place, and a share in the covenant inheritance. Unity was found not in sameness, but in shared devotion to God and in the intertwining of destinies under his blessing. Moses reminded the people of God's majesty, declaring that no one was like their God, who rode across the heavens to help them, whose everlasting arms upheld them. This vision of God's power and protection was the foundation of every blessing, for the tribes could only flourish when sheltered by his presence. The blessings carried a tone of hope. Though Moses would not cross with them, his words pointed forward, urging them to embrace the land with courage and trust. His blessings were a bridge between wilderness wandering and promised inheritance, a fatherly encouragement to remain faithful and to live under the shadow of divine favor. In this farewell, Moses poured out both his love and his faith. He blessed them not out of ritual duty, but out of deep conviction that their God was faithful, that their inheritance was secure, and that their identity as his people was unshakable. His blessings became a lasting testimony of a leader's heart for the people he had served to the very end of his life. After blessing the tribes, Moses made his final ascent. He climbed Mount Nebo to the heights of Pisgah, where his eyes could behold the land of promise stretched out before him. From that mountain, the Lord showed him the breadth of Canaan, the inheritance that Israel was about to receive. It was a vision filled with both joy and sorrow, for Moses could see the fulfillment of the promise, but knew his feet would not cross the Jordan. This moment carried great poignancy. Moses had led the people from Egypt, stood before Pharaoh, lifted his staff over the sea, received the law on Sinai, and interceded countless times for a rebellious nation. He had borne their burdens, endured their complaints, and guided them through 40 years of wilderness. Now his journey was complete, not in the land itself, but on the mountain overlooking it. Scripture describes his death with simplicity, yet with profound depth. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab as God had spoken. His burial place was kept hidden, known only to God, a mystery that preserved the sacredness of his passing. No monument was raised, no shrine was built, for his legacy was not in stone, but in the living memory of a people, and in the words he had spoken. Moses was described as a man of unmatched relationship with God. No prophet had arisen like him, who knew the Lord face to face, who performed such signs and wonders, who spoke with authority and intimacy. His life was unique, and his leadership carried a weight that shaped Israel's identity for generations. The people wept for him in the plains of Moab, mourning the loss of the leader who had guided them for so long. Their grief was not only for the man, but for the era that closed with his passing. Yet even in mourning, there was a sense of transition, for leadership did not end with Moses. Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom, prepared to lead the people forward. The death of Moses revealed both human limitation and divine faithfulness. Though he could not cross the river, the promise remained secure. Though his life ended, the covenant endured. His role was complete, but the story of God's people continued. His death was not a defeat, but a reminder that no human leader is ultimate, for God himself carries the story forward. On Mount Nebo, Moses saw the faithfulness of God with his own eyes. He had doubted, struggled, and pleaded along the way, yet he reached the place where the promise was visible. His final sight was not wilderness, but inheritance, not failure, but fulfillment. In this way, his life testified that God's word never fails, even if the servant's journey comes to a close before the fullness is experienced. The death of Moses remains one of the most moving moments in Israel's story, the passing of a leader whose faith, flaws, courage, and devotion were woven into the very fabric of the nation. His final journey ended on a mountain, but his influence reached across generations, pointing always beyond himself to the faithfulness of the Lord. With the passing of Moses, a new chapter in Israel's story began. Joshua stepped forward as the chosen leader, filled with the spirit of wisdom, prepared to guide the people across the Jordan. The wilderness years were behind them, and before them lay the land promised to their fathers. This was not merely a change of location, it was the beginning of life, as a nation rooted in inheritance, law, and covenant identity. The people stood poised on the edge of fulfillment, their hearts carrying the memory of desert trials and their eyes fixed on a future shaped by obedience. The commands of Deuteronomy became their guide, not as distant words, but as the foundation for life in the land. The covenant was their anchor, reminding them of who they were and how they were called to live. Crossing into the land meant more than conquest. It meant responsibility. They were to live as a people set apart, to reflect the justice, mercy, and holiness of their God. Prosperity would test them as surely as scarcity had, and the call of Moses' words echoed in their ears: choose life, remain faithful, walk in covenant loyalty. The story of Deuteronomy is not confined to its time, for its themes reach across the centuries. It speaks to the importance of remembering the past, of teaching the next generation, of worshiping in purity, of choosing faithfulness over idolatry. It reminds all who hear it that life is found not in power or wealth, but in devotion to the living God. As Israel prepared to step into the land, their legacy was already clear. They were a people shaped by covenant, called to live in obedience, and invited to experience blessing. Their journey through wilderness and their covenant at Moab would stand as testimony for generations to come. Deuteronomy closes not with finality, but with continuity. The words of Moses continued to guide, the covenant continued to bind, and the presence of God continued to sustain. Israel moved forward into promise, carrying with them the lessons of the past and the call to faithfulness that would define their future. The legacy of faithfulness was never meant for one generation alone. It was to be remembered, lived, and shared, a testimony of covenant love and divine faithfulness that would endure through all time. The story that began in wilderness would continue in the land, grounded in the truth that blessing flows from obedience and life is found in loyalty to God. Thank you for joining this journey through the Book of Deuteronomy, where covenant, law, blessing, and warning come together as a living message of faithfulness. If you found this video meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you will not miss future content. Give the video a like to show your support, leave a comment to share your thoughts or reflections, and pass it along to family and friends so they too can be encouraged by these timeless truths.